Okay. All right, I think it's a good time to get started. All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining us at today's ElderSAFE program. I'm Rochelle Furneaux, standing in today for Sydney Palinkas, who was unable to join us today. Today's program, Older Adults and Suicide, an Introduction to Screening and Intervention. We're excited to be hosting this webinar again with EveryMind. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the webinar and type all questions and comments into the chat box. We'll be answering questions after the presentation today, and a copy of this recording and PowerPoint will be sent out to you tomorrow. The webinar offers two category 1 social work continuing education credits. Please ensure that your name on the Zoom is the name that you registered with. In order to be eligible for CEUs, you must be present for the entire live webinar. By tomorrow morning, you'll receive a follow-up email with an evaluation link to request certificates. The webinar is hosted by the ElderSAFE Center, a program of Charles E. Smith Life Communities. Located in Montgomery County, Maryland, we serve older adults throughout the community that have experienced abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation. I'm excited to hand things over today to today's presenters from EveryMind, Amy Fier and Rachel Larkin.
I think Rochelle covered this already. Should we go to the next slide there?
Okay, should we just go ahead and introduce ourselves, Rachel?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Fier. I am a licensed social worker. I work with EveryMind, and I oversee a few programs within EveryMind, the Representative Payee program, Friendly Visitor program, and our SOAR program with EveryMind.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Larkin. I'm a licensed social worker. I'm Director of Crisis Prevention and Intervention Services at EveryMind, and I oversee the hotline program, which includes Lifeline and 988. Happy to spend the afternoon with you.
Thank you. And then, again, this is some ElderSAFE information. I guess, Rochelle, you're going to take that over.
Oh, so sorry about that. We have a language accessible helpline that is available Monday through Friday between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. The telephone number is up on your screen. It's 301-816-5099. We offer temporary safe shelter, community education, and advocacy.
Thank you. It's a bit confusing when we have a Rochelle and a Rachel.
All right, everyone. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. So why are we here today? So we're here to talk about a very important topic, older adults and suicide, and really delve a little deeper into how to assess for suicide, how to talk about suicide, and what kind of interventions we can what are our options for interventions related to suicide? So we're here today to discuss this important topic because about 20% of older adults suffer from a mental disorder. It is common and it's something important to talk about. We are often seeing older adults that are misdiagnosed with other things that maybe are not necessarily correct or just misdiagnosed and undertreated, and often suffering from depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. And we want to make sure that people are aware of that so that they can be advocates for themselves and their loved ones, and get the treatment they need. Only about 2/3 of older adults with a mental health need, only 2/3 of older adults with mental health needs do not receive the treatment they need. So that means only about 1/3 do. So we're gonna, of course, talk about the suicidal state of mind later on. This YouTube video is a TED Talk, and we put it in here for your reference. It is about 11 minutes long, so we're not going to play it, but it's something that you can look at on your own time when you receive the copies of the slides. You can check that out, and just a nice TED Talk to understand sort of the state of mind, and really how we're often thinking about what things should look like versus what they actually experience.
So I'm also going to briefly go over some suicide terminology, because suicide is an area where there's still a lot of stigma. So it's really important to use correct language. A suicide survivor is not somebody who has attempted and survived, but is a family member, significant other, acquaintance who experienced the loss of a loved one due to suicide. A suicide attempt survivor is somebody who has survived a previous suicide attempt. Means are the instruments or objects used to carry out a self-destructive act. Method is the actions or techniques that result in the individual inflicting self-injurious behavior on themselves. Back in the day, it was called self-harm, but now it's called non-suicidal self-injury. Say that 5 times fast, but that is the term. And we try not to say commit suicide. Commit suicide is a really pejorative term. The community of lived experience really doesn't like that. Commit is, you commit a crime. So we really try to say that. You can say died by suicide, ended their life, but we don't want to say that when we're referring to folks around who have died by suicide. So I'm going to just briefly touch on statistics. Most people's brains glaze over when you start talking stats. I'm going to try to hit the highlights of it. But if you're really into stats, and I know there's some people out there, the 2 best places to go are the CDC and suicidology.org if you really want to do a deep dive into stats. So in 2020, and suicide stats are always lag behind by 2 or 3 years, the United States had 45,000 deaths by suicide. It's often as many as there are homicides. It is a huge issue that didn't get a lot of attention until recently. The suicide rate for people aged 55 to 74 had significant declines in 2020, 1% decline for those 75 and older. 2020 was a tricky year because that's when that is when COVID started. So that doesn't mean suicide isn't a problem anymore. There's a lot of different factors that could have impacted that decline, and we're patiently waiting for 2021 data to see if that decline held. In general, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and non-Hispanic Caucasians have the highest suicide rates. Next slide. So these are the ranges over the years. So we saw a couple age ranges decline, as you can see in 2020. The last one, the orange, the very orange one at the top, that is 85 plus. So that continues to climb. It does go up and down. But again, this is not a problem that's going away by any stretch of the imagination. And most discussion about mental health in this country basically is that we are on the tip of a tsunami of mental health problems that's going to impact us all. And suicide is unfortunately, an indicator of that. So that we expect the suicide rates to go up in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So if you're going to walk away with a statistic that you remember, I want you to remember this one. Older adult suicide attempts are more lethal. And that's why I'm so glad that there are 342 of you here today, because of this statistic. So for the general population, there's an estimated 25 suicide attempts for every completed suicide. So for everybody who dies by suicide, 25 people try. But for the older adult population, every 1 in 4 suicide attempts results in death, right? So that is why this is so important to be talking about with your clientele, to be keeping in mind, because when folks of this age group do decide to make an attempt on their life, they're much more likely to die by that attempt. And that is really why this is such a big issue. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so if you guys don't mind putting in chat the response to this question, how might stigma impact an older adult asking for help with a mental health issue? Any good responses there? I'm trying to pull it up. Hold on.
Here, I have it. So kind of coming in fast suddenly, but already feel like a burden, cultural issues, don't want to be labeled, less likely to ask, shame, may not seek help, may not ask for help. That some people look at it as a sign of weakness, feeling like no one cares about them, may not be taken seriously, dementia, will not speak up because they do not want to appear weak.
Cultural barriers, that's a huge one.
Fear of judgment.
Great.
Okay, yeah, a lot of the same ones.
Yeah. So there's so many reasons why anybody, particularly an older adult, might not ask for help with a mental health issue. But the problem is, unless we know where they're struggling, we can't help them.
Okay, so we are going to give a case example, and I would like you all to think about this case example as we flow through the presentation and how this specific scenario might be impacted by all of the things that we talk about today. And at the very end, when we talk about safety planning, we will bring Frank back in and talk about how we might be able to safety plan with Frank. So I'm going to read this just because for some of you, this may be really small, but of course, feel free to, read this on your own. So Frank is an 86-year-old veteran. He has lived alone since his wife passed away 10 years ago. He has 2 children who don't visit regularly. He used to enjoy hunting, but he isn't physically able to anymore. A year ago, Frank began dating a woman online. She seemed perfect for him, and she looked like a model in her picture. She told him that she lived overseas, but wanted to one day come to visit him. This was the first time Frank had dated since his wife's passing. He was very happy to have companionship and to be loved again. Over the course of the year, Frank gave her almost $10,000 for various emergencies, investment ideas, and more. When Frank's children found out about the relationship and the money, they were very upset. They told Frank that she was a scammer and asked how he could have been so foolish. Did he really think a woman like that would date him? They deleted his online dating account and social media accounts. Since finding out that his new love was just a scam, Frank has been very depressed. He has tried to not tell anyone about it and stopped seeing some friends to avoid the questions. Frank was connected to the local adult protective services for reporting the scam. He tells the social worker that he is not interested in services. None of this matters anymore. I really just want to be with my wife now. At a doctor's visit, Frank tells the doctor that he has lived a long life and that he is ready to move on. Frank has boxed up his awards and photos from his time in the Marines. He gives the box and his old record collection to his son during their next visit. All right, so lots of information there, but as we move through this presentation, talk a little bit more about risk factors and warning signs and all of that. Keep Frank in mind. You're muted, Reach.
Thank you. I was trying not to cough on you guys. Thank you. So Amy and I did this presentation about a year ago, and a lot of questions came in after we did the presentation and some other presentations they've had. And this was the number one question: can you screen for suicidality over the phone? And as somebody who runs a suicide hotline, I can tell you absolutely. Lifeline and 988 centers screen people for suicide over the phone, text, and chat every minute of every day. You use a lot of the same skills, but our folks are not mental health professionals. They're well trained. They get 80 hours of training, but you can absolutely do it. Couple key things you need to keep in mind if you want to screen over the phone. One, you need to establish rapport. That is huge. And you can easily do it. You can do it over text. You can do it over chat. You want to use open-ended questions about the situation. I'm going to have some examples about that later. And then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the 3-step ask. And this is, I'm briefly bringing it up to you here to sort of whet your appetite, and then we'll go in deeper later. But you're going to state what you've noticed, reflect the change, normalize having suicidal thoughts during a time of crisis, and ask clearly and confidently about suicidality. And I will give you examples of how to do all of that very soon. Before you enter into a conversation with somebody, a couple of things you want to keep in mind, whether it's phone, text, or chat. You want to have resources in case emergency is needed. Now, most folks don't need it, but you want to have those available. You want to also have ground rules about future contacts, and you want to do it at the start and at the end of the contact, right? So sometimes what happens is the person's very emotional, they get into it, and then they felt really bonded with you, and then they're going to only reach out to you, or they're going to constantly contact you. And if you can't be available to them, you need to give them resources that can be at the start and at the finish. And then you want to follow up, phone follow up, and we do email follow up as well. It can save lives. And I'll touch base a little bit more about that as we move further in. Next slide. So general risk factors that contribute to death by suicide, all ages. Okay. So let's talk about Frank and think about if Frank had any of these. Relationship problems is number 1, and this is from the CDC. Problematic substance use, a crisis in the past or upcoming 2 weeks, job or financial problem, a physical health problem, criminal or legal problems, or loss of housing. So put in the chat real quick if you think Frank, from what you heard in that brief description, had any of these. Relationship, definitely, and that's the number 1. All financial, for sure. I don't think he had any. He was drinking a little bit, but there's he has a lot of these risk factors, right? And a lot of the older population does have, physical health problems or financial issues. So this is, the top risk factors according to CDC. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, a little deeper dive into these risk factors. Depression, which is often undertreated in older adults, a recent death of a loved one, Frank lost his wife, physical illness, uncontrolled pain or fear of prolonged illness, perceived poor health, and it's a change. Anytime we experience a change in our life, it can throw us off our equilibrium and impact our mental wellness. Social isolation or loneliness. And that's one of the things, I've been doing this for a very long time. I know you can't tell, right? But when I first started, older white men had the highest suicide rates across the board. And the number one thing was their wife or their partner would pass away and they would become very isolated because the wife was the one that kept the connections with the children, connect the social connections, maybe with the religious institutions, things like that. And so that had a major, major impact on that particular demographic. Major changes in roles such as retirement or loss of spouse or partner, access to lethal means. So do we think Frank has access to lethal means? Anyone? Put it in the chat. Yes. Okay. Why? He was a veteran. Yes. Okay. So one of the things, anybody who has a military history, there's a really good chance that they have a firearm. And you want to always check on that. And then being a victim of abuse is another one. Next slide, please. Loss of independence or sense of purpose, prior suicide attempt, feeling hopeless or helpless, and that's key. So again, you might not perceive that person's situation as hopeless, right? Or you might not perceive Frank as helpless, but it's how he is feeling about the situation. It's his interpretation of where he's at. So remember, it's to use your empathy and try to put yourself in that person's shoes, and it's based on their experience, not what your experience is on the outside. Impulsivity in the context of cognitive impairment, that can happen a lot, and impaired sleep. And we know as we get older, we have impacts on our sleep, and there's a really strong correlation with insomnia, nightmares, and other sleep issues, and suicidality. So those are things that you want to be screening for, and then should trigger in you like, maybe I should screen this person for suicidality. Next slide. So COVID. A third of people who had COVID were diagnosed with a brain or psychiatric disorder within 6 months. Anxiety and mood disorders were the most common. So anybody who has had COVID, you might want to assess for the emotional impact. Was there loneliness and isolation? It's a little bit different now than it was at the start of the pandemic. Things have changed, but there's still a lot of loneliness and isolation, particularly when you're sick. There was a lot of interpersonal violence when you're sort of shut up with your family for weeks on end, substance use and other unhealthy coping. So that was a phenomenon we saw in youth a lot, but it was across all ages. So people who might have used substances socially, because of the pandemic, started using those substances on their own or using them more on their own. So let's imagine Frank, maybe he went to his VFW hall and drank with his buddies, right? But because of COVID, he couldn't do that. So it caused isolation. And then he started drinking at home, and maybe he started drinking too much, or he wasn't, on top of it. And then financial issues, of course, that come along with COVID. Next slide, please. Oh, hand it over to Amy. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. This is another one of those questions that came up from one of our last presentations related to suicide, and people wanted to know, what is the difference between like suicidal ideation or suicide and those who, want death with dignity or who seek medical aid in dying. And so we wanted to kind of outline that here. And I know there's a lot of words on the screen, but really suicidal ideation, it's a response to pain, right? Whether it's physical or mental or both. There's a sense of despair, and people are wanting to end their life as a release from pain and despair, and also whatever perceived burden they may feel they have on others. The difference between someone who seeks medical aid in dying is that they are stricken likely with a life-ending illness or something that is going to cause an extreme amount of pain and suffering in their life. And so the American Association of Suicidology actually recognizes that the practice of medical aid in dying is different from the behavior that is traditionally described as suicide. And really it's about having, for the patient or the individual, it's about having autonomy and dignity over that journey with their terminal illness, and being able to have the independence to manage that in the way that they see best for themselves. And of course, this is not restricted to just older people, right? And so anyone who is experiencing a life-threatening illness, any adult might look at medical aid in dying as an option if they, depending on their situation and what they feel is best for them. Okay. So depression is not a normal part of aging. This is a myth that's out there, and that TED Talk that I noted in the beginning is really kind of discusses this, but it's not a normal part of aging. There are other things, of course, that are normal parts of aging, health issues, challenges with mobility, certain losses related to cognition or memory, or even things like vision or hearing. Those are things that come with age for some people, but depression is not one of them. So if you or someone you love is experiencing depression and you go to a doctor and they say, oh, it's normal, you're, in your 70s or 80s or 90s, and this is just a normal part of aging, your, antennas should go up for that. And you should really want to make sure you advocate for yourself or your loved one, and potentially look for someone else. If not a different primary care doctor, or maybe look for someone who's in the mental health field, a psychiatrist or a therapist who can really speak to that a little bit more, because it's not something that should be dismissed. Okay. So what are some warning signs that we're going to look for if somebody might be suicidal? So we're going to pay attention to loss of interest in things that somebody once enjoyed. This is kind of a big one, because we want to make sure that individuals are a big shift in something that they've enjoyed to no longer being interested in that can definitely be concerning. Cutting back on social interactions and self-care, grooming, hygiene, those are definitely red flags that we want to pay attention to. Breaking a medical regimen. So not taking their medications, not caring to go to the doctor, especially for someone who is very proactive in their health. And these may be related to passive suicidal ideation, which we discuss a little bit later on, but not necessarily active suicidal ideation. Experiencing or expecting significant loss. This is one of the things that we highlighted about Frank, right? He had a loss of his wife, and then he also had, in some ways, a loss of this woman that he met online, with that relationship. Feeling hopeless, helpless, and or worthless. These are very extreme feelings. So if somebody is discussing that, we want to make sure we're paying attention to that. Putting affairs in order, so changing a will, giving away prized possessions. Again, something that came up with Frank when he started putting things away for his son. Stockpiling medication or obtaining other means. So obviously, if somebody, not necessarily in Frank's case, because we are thinking that he may have a firearm or some kind of weapon, but if somebody suddenly decides that they're going to purchase a gun, and that's not something that they had before or showed an interest in having before, that is a red flag, of course. And then stockpiling any medication because they may be thinking of overdose. Preoccupation with death. So obviously, we want to assess what that means to that particular individual. But if you're hearing things that sound concerning, particularly to their safety, we want to pay attention to that. And then somatic symptoms with no medical explanation. So oftentimes for older adults, what they're identifying is something that is physical, a somatic symptom: headaches, stomach pain, fatigue, not being able to sleep. Whoops, I went ahead here. Changes in appetite, and maybe going to their primary care doctor to talk about those things, and hoping or maybe looking for a physical reason why this might be happening. And this is, again, why being an advocate for yourself is so important, or for your loved one, because if there are no physical or somatic symptoms or physical illnesses that are found, we want to make sure people are being assessed for mental health needs, not just told that it's okay, it's happening because this is a normal part of aging. Okay. So we talk about bereavement a little bit here because this is such a common part of aging. As people age, you may lose loved ones, people in your social circle, just it becomes a more prevalent part of life. And we want to be able to differentiate between grief that is healthy and when grief is a concern. And another note here that this can be different for everyone. And of course, depending on the connection to the person or to the situation. But in general, we're talking about when things are normal and when things are concerning, sort of the difference between that. So when grief is normal, people may experience crying, sobbing, tears, changes in sleep patterns, an overall lack of energy, feeling lethargic or apathetic to day-to-day tasks, changes in appetite, withdrawal of normal functioning, of normal relationships or interactions, difficulty concentrating, questioning spiritual or religious beliefs, and feeling a mix of emotions that range from anger to guilt to loneliness, emptiness, sadness, but still occasionally being able to experience moments of joy and happiness, even if that comes with some guilt, right? Oftentimes people feel a sense of guilt if they are able to laugh after the death of a loved one. But that mix of emotions. Bereavement is a concern when the emotions become anger, irritation, or episodes of rage. Again, anger is normal, but chronic or long-term anger or episodes of rage, an inability to focus on anything but the death of the loved one, focusing intensely on reminders of the deceased or avoiding those reminders, intense feelings of sadness, pain, detachment, low self-esteem, or longing to be in the deceased's presence, problems accepting the reality of the death, self-destructive behaviors such as alcohol or drug abuse or other kinds of risky behaviors, and then suicidal thoughts and actions. So there's no time frame, right, that we can give. But if there is this prolonged intensity when it comes to the grief, then we want to sort of pay attention to that and look at how that is impacting the individual. Okay. What are some protective factors, right? When we think about protective factors, these are things that are beneficial in someone's life, that may be things that protect them from maybe creating a plan for suicide or taking additional steps. These are things that we want to cling onto when we're talking to people and assessing, which I know Rachel's going to talk about in a little bit. But these are things that are going to maybe protect people from trying to commit suicide. So care for mental and physical health problems. So the more tuned in to their physical and mental health, the better chance they have of being willing to seek treatment. And so people who are really proactive in their mental and physical health, social connectedness, right? So having social connections, having family, friends, religious, groups, neighbors, whatever that might be, where they feel a social connection, skills in coping and adapting to change. We're going to talk kind of at the very end, but we're going to talk about the difference between coping skills and coping mechanisms, having a sense of purpose, and a perception of autonomy, right? So having some autonomy in their life. And it's really the perception that matters, not necessarily the reality. These are some special considerations that we think about for older adults related to suicide. And Our last presentation that we did was sort of focused on elder abuse and the presence of abuse or neglect and how that relates to depression and potential suicide. And so here we're delving into a little bit more deeply how to assess and intervene with suicide, but abuse and neglect is definitely a serious risk factor. Passive suicidal ideation and passive suicide. So here we're talking about when people are not necessarily actively suicidal, but when they have sort of an ambivalence and a feeling that things, things might just happen, or making statements like, oh, my medication doesn't really help. It doesn't really matter if I take it or not. So really having that ambivalence about their health and well-being, self-neglect or self-harm in older adults, financial concerns, we talked about that. And then again, that idea that older adults are undertreated and underreported, and that there is a perception that people don't have suicidal thoughts or intent when they are in this population. Okay, sorry, I was just looking at the chat here. And then bringing up the special concern of medication side effects and health-related issues. So we know that older adults are more susceptible to medication side effects. They also may be on more medications than someone who's younger. And so those side effects and the side effects of different combinations of medications, we don't know how somebody might interact, right? Or how those drugs might interact in someone and how it might impact someone. And so even though we know what side effects might be possible, an older adult taking multiple medications or taking a new medication, really kind of being hyper aware of what the side effects are and how that is making somebody feel. And then also the fact that infections and illnesses may contribute to things that look like psychiatric concerns, right? Case in point, a urinary tract infection. So anyone who's worked in a medical setting or in a hospital knows that if there is a lot of confusion or things that look like dementia or memory loss for an older adult, being brought into the emergency room, one of the first things we want to look for is a urinary tract infection, because that can create a lot of confusion and things that appear like psychiatric concerns that are not actually psychiatric concerns. Somebody noted in the chat dehydration. Yes, another one. So just these again are just special considerations when we're talking about older adults.
Okay, everybody. So I'm going to do a quick poll. Please be honest and tell us how comfortable you feel talking about suicide. Is it appearing up? Okay, great. Right. Okay, about 75% of folks answered. That is great. Give it one more second. So I love this group of people because you are very comfortable and somewhat comfortable. That is fantastic, because what I've seen, I've been doing this for 15 years and I love talking about suicide. Sometimes you can't shut me up about it, but when I go to parties and I introduce myself and people are like, what kind of social worker, or what do you do? I'm like, well, I do suicide prevention. And sometimes people back away slowly. And I get that. It can be a little bit of an uncomfortable topic. But for me, having done this for so long, it's one of the most hopeful things you can do, because you really can make such a huge difference in people's lives. Next slide. Okay. Thanks. It keeps asking me to share the poll. So the suicidal state of mind, let's talk about that, because if you haven't been there, and many of us have been, statistically speaking, if you haven't been there in a while, it's hard to remember. It's hard to understand what is going on in the head of somebody who is suicidal. And this is from the work of Thomas Joyner. But what this person is experiencing is intense emotional pain. And it is all encompassing. And when the mind gets very, very upset, as some of you clinicians know, the logic center of the brain shuts down, right? And we are working from the back, the amygdala, the hippocampus, where it's sort of pure emotion and it is sort of running the show, and you sort of can't think through problems as well. And it's just very overwhelming. It's a belief that one cannot tolerate or endure emotional pain. They've done a study of people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived, and they found that most of them are pretty happy they survived. And what they didn't necessarily want to die, they wanted the pain to end. And that's a pretty key difference. It's a feeling of being isolated that no one understands or cares very much. And again, it's that person's internal feeling, because from the outside, we can see, look, this person has so many friends and so many family that loves them, but it's that internal feeling, that perception. And then the perception that you are a burden on others, again, that is that person's perception, not our perception from the outside. And really the key is it's a feeling that there's no way to escape that emotional pain except by dying. You are in so much pain, you need that pain to end. And so dying seems like the only way to get it to end. Next slide, please. Okay, a lot of words on this page, but remember at the beginning, I told you rapport is really key to doing a suicide screening over the phone, text, or chat. Well, rapport and open questions are really what's key to doing any sort of suicidal screening. You have to have that person to feel comfortable, right? To share something like that, where there's so much stigma with another person is hard. And so you need to make it as easy as possible for that person. So think about those of you who have kids or grandkids. When you pick the kid up from school, you don't say, did you have a good day at school? Because they're going to be like, yes or no. You'll get no information, right? You're going to say, tell me about the hardest part of the school day, or what was the most fun you had at school today, to get more information, right? Closed questions are questions that give you a yes or no answer. Are you doing well today? Yes or no. Did you learn anything this week? Do you have any goals? Does that make you happy? Are you worried about that? Do you need help? Do you want to talk about it? All those can be answered with a yes or no. To really build that rapport and get information about what your client is going through and sort of get those hints, those invitations to sort of talk more about it, you're going to ask those open questions. Tell me about your day today. What can I help you with? What are you most worried about? Tell me about the supports you have in your life. Where do you see yourself in 6 months? And our favorite phrase on the hotline, tell me more about that. It really gets you to really help that person open up, because it is so hard to open up to strangers, and it's hard to open up on phone or text or chat. But if you open the door for people to do it and you make them feel comfortable, they will walk through that door. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so we're going to do a deeper dive in this in a minute, but so a brief overview. How do you help anybody in crisis? Well, you take any warning signs seriously. You don't sort of explain away in your own mind a warning sign. If something pops up to you as a warning sign, it's better to screen, right? When you go to your primary care physician and you've got some symptoms, they don't say, we don't need to take your blood pressure. It's probably not X, Y, and Z. They take your blood pressure just in case. And that's the same thing. If you see a warning sign, you're going to screen for suicide, because you might as well. There's no harm in it. And if you don't, it's like going to a primary care physician and not taking your blood pressure or not taking your temperature. Reflect that you notice a change and that you're concerned. And that's the best way to open a conversation with anybody that you're concerned about. You want to create a safe, comfortable place to talk and lots of opportunities to talk. It shouldn't be one conversation. And again, this can be done over phone or text or chat. Be non-judgmental. And that's easier said than done, because a lot of times we don't even realize what we say can be judgmental, even if our intent is not there. We're going to offer hope and alternatives. If we do hear about suicidality, we're going to take action if the person's in danger. And then we're going to ask directly, If we suspect a person has warning signs or risk factors, we're going to ask them if they're planning on ending their life. And if they say yes, we're going to ask, do they have a plan? When are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? And this is my favorite question. And I think this is a great question for older adults. How close have you ever come to taking your life before? Back in the day, we used to ask, because have you ever attempted suicide before? But that question leaves out the people that maybe held a gun in their hand, but never pulled the trigger, right? So they held a gun to their head, but they never pulled the trigger. That's technically not a suicide attempt, but boy, oh boy, that is rehearsal and preparation, and that's coming pretty close to doing it, right? If you've counted out your pills and put them all on the table before you and stared at them and tried to figure out how many it would take to actually kill you, that's coming, pretty close, but you didn't take the pill, so therefore it's not a suicide attempt. That's a really good question to ask to let you know what the risk level of that person has, what the danger is. And also it's going to let you know what kind of means they've considered in the past. So again, take that question and definitely put it in, and you can use it for other things too. How many, so it's an open-ended question. It's not a yes or no question, and it gives you a lot of information. Next slide. Okay, sorry, I didn't know where exactly to put this, but I wanted to let you know that anytime that you're screening somebody for suicide, Lifeline and 988 is there to support you. 988 is actually going live July 16th, but 988 is actually not a new service. Hopefully you guys have all heard of it. It is just an easier way to reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And we have people call us every day, including clinicians, and say, I have a suicidal client, help me screen this person. And you can do it. It's free, it's 24/7. You don't have to be suicidal to use it. Specialists will listen and do a risk assessment. Safety planner help you with that. I wanted to just sort of tell you, to sort of reassure you about the process. So when a person calls in crisis to Lifeline, 80% of those calls are answered resolved on the phone. And actually here in Maryland, if you're in a Maryland center, across the state, our resolution rate is greater than 90%. So 90% of callers get off the phone after speaking to Lifeline and they don't need anything else, right? There is a 211. 211 press 1 is actually going away. 211, regular plain 211 is actually for resources. So like if you need help with your power bill, if you need food stamps, that's 211. For a while, Maryland had a program called 211 press 1, which is for if you're in a mental health crisis, but that's going away in the wake of 988. So it's still functional now, but it will actually eventually go away. 988 is the same thing as Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK. But another reason why I bring this up is that talking and doing risk assessment and safety planning, which we're going to talk about a little bit, does most of the work that you need to do with somebody and really can make a huge difference. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So why we shouldn't be afraid to talk about suicide, because a lot of people, especially for clinicians, right, they're worried that they could get sued. And if you're really worried about that, there's a lawyer named Skip Simpson. He is kind of an expert on malpractice for clinicians, particularly around suicide. There's a lot of work that he does, but you're more likely to get sued if you don't ask about suicide than if you do. Talking about suicide and one's reasons for wanting to die can bring about the counter impulse to talk about reasons for wanting to live. So again, naturally, as we're talking about all the why, so if we're talking to Frank and he's telling you about why he wants to die, he lost his wife, he lost his girlfriend, he spent all this money, he's embarrassed, blah, 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 blah. He's also, naturally, his brain is going to start popping in and filling in with the reasons why he should live for his kids, for his grandkids. Yes, 988 is a nationwide number to call. It is going live in July, but right now it is nationwide to call 1-800-273-TALK. And there are some parts of this country where 988 is already active for text as well. And there's chat. Sorry, I keep seeing 988 questions come through at the bottom of my screen. Yeah. So, but again, so don't be afraid to ask, right? If we as mental health providers aren't comfortable talking about suicide, how can we expect our clients to tell us about it? they pick up on that. And if they know you're uncomfortable, they're not going to tell you. Every day we talk to people who are suicidal and they have therapists and they haven't told their therapist, one, because their therapist has never asked them. That's why screening is important. And two, they're afraid of how, thank you, Amy, how their therapist is going to react. And so we need to make it a comfortable topic when we're talking to our clients, because if we don't make it comfortable, they're not going to volunteer it to us. And again, study after study after study has shown that asking about suicide does not make people want to go do it. It's not suggestible. We can't be like, oh, have you thought about suicide? No, but that's a great idea. It doesn't happen like that, right? If we don't ask about suicide, we will never know if somebody's suicidal. Okay. And feeling seen without judgment reduces feelings of isolation, even if suicidal ideations are present. Now, if you go back to the stats I presented earlier, 45,000 people in the United States died in 2020 from suicide. That's too many. But millions of people in 2020 experienced suicidal ideation and they didn't do it. So just because you're suicidal doesn't mean you're going to die by suicide, and talking about it makes a huge difference. You don't have to have all the answers to be helpful. You just have to care and get that person connected to the right person, right? So some people are afraid to start that conversation because they don't know exactly what to say. That's okay. Just saying, hey, I'm concerned about you, let's talk about this, is enough to make a difference. And then you could connect them to somebody who can do a better risk assessment. You can connect them to 988 Lifeline. But don't be afraid to have the conversation because you don't have all the answers, because the conversation itself is incredibly valuable. And we'll come back around to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so just suggestions when you're dealing with a suicidal person. Don't act angry, shocked, or panicked. Also, don't act nonchalant. There was a study of how psychiatrists ask about suicidality, and they used to ask, in the study they found that psychiatrists ask in this way: you're not suicidal, are you? And they're very nonchalant about it. And of course, what that does is solicit an answer that, no, I'm not suicidal. People are looking to see if you're going to be able to handle their answer. So you want to be as calm and sensitive as possible. You don't want to avoid the discussion. You don't want to taunt or dare them to do it or make them feel guilty about having suicidal ideation. Oops. Where'd my slide go? Thanks, Amy. Sorry. I will find my slide on here while Amy's getting that pulled back up so I can keep talking. Okay. They don't, so don't
Sorry, give me a minute. I'll pull it back up in a second.
That's okay. I'll talk off my slide just as Amy pulls it back up. Don't be sworn to secrecy. Don't make empty promises. Don't promise them that they'll get don't promise Frank he's going to get his $10,000 back. Don't promise him that his girlfriend will get back together with him or whatever. You don't make empty promises or offer false hope. But you can say you can keep going. Don't leave a high-risk suicidal person alone. And I put it in quotation marks because if somebody's high risk, you might be screening them over the phone, but you want to get them connected to somebody right away. Don't give advice or try to fix the problem. So all of us as caring human beings, especially when that person is really close to us, when they're in pain, we want to fix the pain as soon as possible. But that doesn't help with the suicidality. You can give Frank $10,000 to make up for what he lost, but that's not going to help his feelings of embarrassment and grief and loss. Don't say I understand. Amy, you have the presenter mode on, or it was. Okay, now we're back. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So don't say I understand. Think about a teenager. If you've had a teenager and you say I understand, the first thing they're going to say to you is, you don't understand, right? How could you understand? So everybody's pain, everybody's feelings are very unique. Sorry, I lost my words there for a second. And so you can say that's understandable, or I want to learn more about how you're feeling, but try not to say I understand. Many of us have been there, have dealt with suicidal ideation, maybe have made an attempt. And while that is very valuable, you don't want to turn the conversation around to you. So you don't want to say things like, when I was feeling suicidal or when I was having thoughts like that, this is what worked for me. You can make suggestions about what might be helpful, but you don't want to make that conversation about you and your experience, because their experience might be very different. You don't want to say to whatever they're concerned about that it's no big deal, right? There's a loved one in my family who just had their colon removed and they're in a colostomy, and they're very, very depressed and upset that they're going to have a colostomy bag for the rest of their life. And you know, some members of the family are like, it's not a big deal, nobody cares, it's, you know, it's fine, you're still you. But to him, it's a huge deal. And so you meet that person where they're at. And if it's a big deal to them, it's a big deal. Do say, I'm here to listen, and then don't talk. So hard not to talk because you just want to fill that empty space, but give them space to let it out. What have you tried already? If you're one of those people that likes to problem solve, and some of us, you know, are pulled to do that, you want to ask questions that are helpful and not jump in and solve it. So asking, what have you tried already to help you in the situation, is going to give you a lot of information. You know, I went to my primary care physician because I'm having stomach aches. Okay, that's a good first step. What about going to somebody, you know, this person or somebody who can help you more specifically with that, like Amy said earlier. You want to reflect how badly they feel. I'm going to show you guys a video in a few minutes, or maybe a minute, I don't know where I am in the slides, about how rushing to cheer somebody up is actually more detrimental than listening and reflecting that you hear how badly they feel. This one is so key. What do you need from me? Often what people need is so small and so simple, and you can do a tremendous amount. And when we hear suicide, we like build these complicated schemes in our brain and we kind of get panicked. But often what they need is just something so little and so small that we can really make a big difference. And then, you know, when we get to safety planning, how can we work together to help you be safe? Because we're working together. It's not the suicidal person's job to heal themselves. We're a team, and we're going to support them. They have to do the hard work, but let them know that we're going to work with them to support them, to help them during this time. Next slide. Okay, so more things to say and not to say. Okay, anytime somebody shares they're suicidal, please say thank you for sharing that with me. It's an incredibly brave act for anybody to admit that they're suicidal. I'm hoping that, you know, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we don't have to be worried about saying that. But for right now, it is a brave act. So you want to acknowledge that. You want to reflect that life is difficult for that person right now. You want to reflect that they're not willing to live with the pain that they're in anymore, and they want the pain to end, right? That you're having the thought that you don't deserve to live. And this is for those of you who like the cognitive behavioral approach, this is a key CBT sort of tool here. What you're doing is you are reframing that suicidal ideation to a thought, and it's much easier to deal with when it's a thought that you know are having trouble with than like, I need to die. So you're having the thought that I don't deserve to live, and helping reframe in that way can be really key. Please do not say we have to call 911 right now the instant somebody mentions suicide. There is an agency in Montgomery County, I'm not going to name which, where the clinicians were instructed, if somebody mentions suicide, you have to call 911. And there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to do that. We're going to delve into them in a little bit. Don't guilt trip them and saying you can't do that because your children, your family, your grandchildren. Don't say suicide is a sin. And don't be like, you know, tomorrow is another day and it's always darkest before the dawn, because that's it's sort of like patting a child on the head, like, you'll be okay, it's fine. And that's not what the suicidal person needs. So now we're going to watch a brief video. I think it's 6 minutes long. I love this video. This is a video about how to talk to somebody who's grieving. But this is what we use in hotline training and how to listen to somebody who's suicidal. And it is so, so key. So 6 minutes. I want you guys all to really, if you've been doing dishes or whatever, please take a minute. It's 4 minutes. Please take a minute to really come back to your screen, or if you're doing folding laundry, and really watch this, because everybody who sees this video says it is really helpful. All right. Thank you, Amy. I don't hear sound, Amy, so you might need to stop sharing and then reshare with sound enabled, because that's always the problem when I do this, is I don't enable the sound. Which my staff has taught me, and they have to tell me every single time I do a presentation, Rachel, you have to enable the sound.
Okay, we're just talking about enabling the sound in the actual.
I think that when you hit share, before you actually share it, there's a button that says, hang on. Yeah, okay, so when you hit share at the bottom, it says share sound there. Thank you.
In our own lives. And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better?
Okay, so now, yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna start it over here again.
Thank you.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up, but here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Sorry, I muted myself. So if you guys, I would love for you to share your reactions to that video. What do you think? You can use little reactions, emoji things, or, put a comment. But this is so key when you are talking to somebody who's suicidal. You cannot be the rabbit pooping rainbows. I mean, I hate to be blunt, but you can't. And that's what a lot of people want to do. You have to join that person in their pain and witness their pain and listen to their pain. And that is healing. And that is, part of the reason why that 90% of calls to Lifeline to 98 end with us, because that is a powerful, powerful experience. And the other part is that risk assessment and the safety planning. So, I love this video. You'll have, I think there'll be the URL for you guys if you need it, but watch it again, because I think it's really meaningful and will help you have those really difficult conversations and help, all of us when in our daily lives, when we talk to a friend or a family member who is in pain and we want to rush in and cheer them up, and to sort of hold ourselves back and just witness it and reflect it back to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do you do, right? I briefly talked about this earlier. How do you ask about suicide? So you're going to state that you've noticed a change in the person, or that you gave them a screening. I don't know if you use the ask or there's a bunch of different screening tools. And then you normalize suicide ideation, and then you ask directly. For example, with Frank. Frank, I noticed you keep saying things like, none of this matters anymore, and I really just want to be with my wife. Sometimes when people are overwhelmed, they think about suicide. Are you thinking about ending your life? You want to be straight, and you want to be clear, and this is a really good invitation for somebody to be open to you. You are saying, this is what I heard. I'm witnessing your pain. You are normalizing that when people are in pain, they think about suicide, and then you're asking directly. This is a really good formula for any time you want to ask, and you can use it for asking about other things too, but it's a really good formula for asking about suicide. Next question. Next slide. All right, so building on that, right? I want you to put in the chat what you think. I'm gonna read you this exchange, and I want you to tell me what you think about this exchange. The therapist says to the client, you've been really struggling since losing your job. Often when people feel hopeless in this situation, they think about ending their lives. Is that something you have thought about? The client says, no, I could never do that to my mother. It would kill her. And the therapist says, good. What do you think about that? Put it in the chat. There you go, Courtney. All right, yes. So the first thing, not very supportive. So the first question is good. So the therapist in the first part is reflecting what they're noticing, they're normalizing the situation, and they're asking. But when the client replies no, and the therapist says good, or has that, oh, thank goodness. What you're doing is you're shutting down the conversation. You're telling that client that you wouldn't feel good, or you're not comfortable with them being suicidal. So, it might be an expression of your relief, but you don't want to answer like that, because that client could not be comfortable telling you yet. Or maybe they're not suicidal now, but they could be suicidal in a week, and they're not going to be wanting to tell you that because of your answer. So what is a better way to respond when the client says, no, I could never do that to my mother, it would kill her? Put it in the chat, making you guys do some of the work, not just me and Amy here today. What's a better answer when the client says that? Can reflect again. Thank you for sharing that with me. Tell me more. Somebody's been trained on a hotline. Tell me more. Tell me more. Let's talk more about your mom and how important she is to you. I'm glad she's such a good support. But good just shuts it down. All right, so let's move on to question 2. I'm trying to be mindful of our time. Would you ask Frank or this client, are you thinking about hurting yourself, instead of, are you thinking about ending your life? Say yes or no. No, nope, nope. Some yeses, a lot of no's, some yeses. Okay. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir with this crowd. Okay, so the answer is no, because you need to, for several reasons. One, if you're asking about suicide, you need to ask about suicide. Are you hurting yourself is too vague. If you're beating around the bush asking the question, the client is going to know that you're too scared of the question and is not going to give you an answer. They're going to tell you what you want to hear, not what they're actually feeling. 2, hurting yourself is too vague because the person may be intending self-harm and not be intending suicidality, or the person may see suicide as an end to pain and not causing themselves more hurt, right? So when this question is much too vague, you want to say, think about killing yourself. Are you thinking about ending your life? Are you thinking about taking your life? You can use suicide, but I wouldn't use that with a lot of populations, particularly people who English is not their first language. It's a very stigmatizing term. Are you thinking about ending your life, killing yourself? Be very clear and ask directly, right? You're not going to ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because they might not see suicide as that, or they might be afraid to give you the answer. Next slide. Okay, further assessment. So we mentioned some of these questions earlier. So if the person says, yes, I've been thinking about ending my life. I can't take, Frank says, I can't take this anymore. I'm too embarrassed. I just want to be with my life. I've been thinking about ending my life. Okay, have you decided how you're going to kill yourself? So then you're going to get the information from Frank. Is he going to drink himself to death? Is he going to overdose? Is he going to shoot himself? Have you decided when you're going to do it? Sometimes, particularly some older people, they're waiting for a milestone. I'm waiting for this diagnosis. I'm waiting for my grandchild to graduate from high school. I'm waiting for this to happen. Oftentimes, you need to know when you're assessing the risk, how imminent the situation is. Are they going home after the session to do it? Or is it 3 months, 6 months down the road? Do you have the means to do it? So Frank says he's going to shoot himself. Does he have a firearm? How many firearms does he have? What is the closest, like I mentioned earlier, what is the closest you've ever come to taking your own life? So anybody who's been rehearsing it, maybe holding that gun to their head or counting out the pills, they are going to be at higher risk than somebody who hasn't done a rehearsal. Same thing, if they can be suicidal. Lily, I wouldn't say, do you have a plan in place? Because that's a very technical term. I would just say, have you decided how you're going to do it? They might not think of it as a plan. They might think of it, that's how we say it. And clinicals are like, do they have a plan? Well, yeah. But you want to be very clear around this to your clients. You don't want to have any ambiguity. So you know exactly what you're doing with, so you know exactly what to do next, right? So again, some people are suicidal, they don't have a plan. They are a lower risk. Some people are suicidal, they have a plan, but they don't have the means, right? Have you been self-harming? So don't have time to do a deep dive into non-suicidal self-injury, but when you self-harm, you are not afraid to cause yourself pain. One of the things that stops a lot of people from making an attempt on their life is they're afraid it's going to hurt, or they're afraid they're going to mess it up and cause themselves pain. People who are self-harming don't have that fear. It's like the final barricade to keep you from driving off the cliff into the sunset is down, right? So self-harming, people who self-harm aren't necessarily suicidal, but if they become suicidal, they're at higher risk of ending their lives. Have you been using alcohol or drugs, right? Alcohol and drugs make you more impulsive. Sometimes people use alcohol or drugs as sort of like a way to numb the pain through the act. So these are really important questions to assess risk, right? And if you get yeses to these questions, you're going to put that person at higher risk. Yes, these are yes or no questions. So in this situation, so I know I talked about open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are really good for getting that conversation started. However, once you move into assessment, you need some yes or no questions. You need yes or no, are they suicidal? Yes or no, do they have a plan? Yes or no, do they have the means? That you can swing back to closed question. Thank you. Somebody was paying close attention to me. Thank you for listening. So yes, the open-ended questions are for when you're opening the conversation, you're getting that person to open up and share with you. But when you're doing the assessment, you need a yes or no. And I would take a maybe as a yes, right? Have you decided how to kill yourself? Maybe. Okay, that in my mind, that's a yes. We're going to talk more about that. But yeah, very good question. Thank you. Next slide. Assess the intent. So what we want to do is we want to assess the intent to which the person expects to carry out the plan and then believes it to be lethal. So then, again, we have a couple open-ended questions here. How likely are you to act on your thoughts? Are you afraid that you might act on your thoughts? And in what situations? Are you fine during the day, but when you're alone at night, is that when you're afraid you're going to act on your thoughts? This is going to give you a lot of information about how to keep that person safe. How badly do you want to die? With people that are more concrete or aren't very good at expressing their emotions, kind of using a little Likert scale helps you. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being very much and 1 not so much, how badly do you want to die? How would you rate your intent to kill yourself now on a scale? What was it this morning? What do you think it's going to be at midnight tonight? Right? That can really help you get a sense of where that person's at, when their danger times are, how you can build a safety plan. And this is key too. What do you see happening if you kill yourself? I'll be in heaven with my wife. That sounds like a really nice place to be. Let's talk more about that. You really miss her, right? And then, because if you go straight to, what about your kids who you're leaving behind? Don't you think they'll feel badly? You're going to lose that person. But if you talk about, I can see why that would, be appealing, as being with your wife in heaven and not being in pain and not being embarrassed anymore. So it gives you sort of a jumping off place to discuss, and it can help you bring in buffers, but if you go straight to buffers or straight to reasons why they shouldn't do it, you're going to lose that person. Next slide, please. Explore ambivalence. So that person is sitting in front of you or on the phone with you or sending you an email, whatever it is, they're communicating with you. They are alive in this very moment. Something has gotten them here. They have held on long enough to be having this conversation with you. And that, most of us hate ambivalence, but in this case, ambivalence is your best friend. So what has kept you from acting on your thoughts, kept you safe up until now? How have you gotten to my office? What's kept you alive up until now? Are there times that you want to die? Tell me about that. Are there times you want to live? If you jump to, are there times you want to live before exploring the times you want to die, you're going to lose them. You need to start with the die first and then want to live. And it'll come out often naturally. What things in your life make you want to go on living? Again, it goes back to, how did you get here? Maybe it's his kids or his grandkids or his buddies at the VFW or whoever, and we talk about this on Hotline all the time. It could be seeing your favorite sports team win. Maybe he's got a dog and he doesn't want to leave the dog behind. Whatever it is that's kept them living to this point is great, and you're going to use them for their safety. Use that for their safety. What do you need to happen in order for you to want to live? For those of you who like motivational interviewing, here is your miracle question. It's sort of a version of, if I could wave a magic wand and make everything better, what would that look like? But what do you need to happen in order for you to want to live, right? And you're going to get some fantastical answers, like if I never given that woman that money, right? Or my wife is still alive. Okay, process that. But then you're also going to get a couple practical things. Maybe Frank doesn't need to be by himself anymore. Maybe he was living with other people. That is going to give you, don't get thrown off by that first answer that is going to be kind of unattainable. You want to be with your wife because you're not feeling, so you wouldn't feel so alone, blah, 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 blah. You can get to some practical things you can do to help that person with this question. Whew. Next slide. Oh, I get to turn it over to Amy. Take a break. All right.
Say you get a break. Okay. All right. So outlook, right? There was, again, for some reason, these slides are always mine, a question that came from our last presentation around outlook and ambivalence, around individuals who don't have a great prognosis in life, or have a lot of barriers and challenges in their life, and how you address the outlook, right? So of course, outlook it's an important part, right? It's a major component of our cognitive behavioral therapy for those of you that are clinicians. And when somebody has a poor or a negative outlook, first of all, it's common, but it's going to impact how it's going to impact their view on, excuse me, their situation. So how do we get someone to improve the outlook just a tiny bit? I mean, we're not talking here about trying to show them all the wonderful things in their life and how, and what Rachel mentioned before about being dismissive or patronizing. It's always darkest before the dawn. Things will get better. You know, those are, again, these are the things we don't want to do, but we do want to explore that person's strengths, right? We do want to look at what has been sources of resilience for them in the past. Have they ever had a challenge and gotten through it? For Frank, right, if we're talking about Frank's situation, how did he find the strength to get by after he lost his wife, right? We're gonna talk about those strengths and those sources of resilience that that person has had in the past. If you're talking to someone who has attempted suicide in the past, actually, I'm going to go back here to this question that Rachel talked about. Here it is, the second one. What made you, you were in a situation where you felt that you wanted to die and you attempted suicide, but you lived. How did you feel when that happened? What were things that made you happy, excited, grateful that you did live, right? Excuse me. So again, trying to shift that a little bit. And again, this is not, we're not going to magically make them feel better by just talking about and trying to have them have a positive outlook, or being dismissive and trying to make things all sunshine and rainbows. But we want to try to shift that a little bit. And again, thinking about the purpose of CBT and how that mode of therapy, that is something that focuses on changing those negative thoughts that can contribute to worsening emotional feelings. And so for those of you that are clinicians, we are thinking about the premise of that. Again, not necessarily going to have time to have a whole CBT session while you're assessing for suicide, but thinking about the premise and trying to pull out those sources of strength and resilience. Okay, here. Buffers and connectedness. Sorry, guys. So we touched on this earlier on, but what are those things in somebody's life that are going to keep them connected to this life? Reasons that they may not commit suicide. These may be the things that we're hearing when someone says, I don't see I don't know how I can handle this pain, but I just can't do that to my daughter, or I just can't leave my dog. These are the pieces that are keeping somebody connected to their life. So support system, ambivalence, like Rachel mentioned before, and some of those tools for pulling on that ambivalence, strong beliefs, whether they be religious or spiritual in some other way, but strong beliefs can be for many people, a major reason why suicide, why maybe they haven't attempted suicide before, or why they're reluctant, to have a suicide attempt. Future plans, what is important to them? What is in their value system? What are the things that matter to them? What has kept them going this long? Again, we're talking about strengths, sources of resilience, and hope. Hope is major, and pulling on any source of hope. If you hear that hopefulness for someone who says, I really want to make it to my grandson's graduation, or I really want to see my son get married, then these are things that are keeping them connected, that we can latch onto. Okay, so we are assessing levels of risk, and for I know for Hotline, this is like, well, I don't know if it still is, but this is like plastered on the wall, right? Reminders of how to assess somebody and place them into these different categories of risk, right? So someone who is a low risk for suicide means that they do not have a plan, and they do not have a history of past attempts. Because remember, a major risk factor is if somebody has attempted suicide previously. So if you know that you're talking to someone who has attempted suicide previously, again, those antennas are going to be up. So what do you want to do? You want to express concern, collaborate with the client to get buy-in, with regards to limiting access to means, right? And so when we're talking about buy-in, it's talking about means, if somebody has that, right? A way that they have thought about attempting suicide, but also when we're talking about buy-in, not just talking about it, but also potentially removing those means if they have those, right? But this person does not have a plan, and they do not have a history of attempts. And so we're going to identify coping strategies. We're going to safety plan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then we're going to, that safety plan may involve informing a primary care physician, a therapist, another professional, or even a family member or friends that they feel comfortable talking to. So this is a person with a low level of risk. Someone with a moderate discussion of limiting access to means. Okay, so somebody asked, if the person doesn't have a plan, how do you get to the discussion of limiting access to means? So this is part of that initial assessment in which Rachel talked about before. You've asked about, are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of ending your life? And if someone says yes, right, they're having suicidal ideations, we're going to ask, I'm not going to go back to that slide because I don't know exactly how far back it is, but we're going to ask about, do they have a plan? Do they have a means? Have they thought about how, where, when? That slide, which maybe at the end I can circle back to it, but that's the conversation around means, right? We're trying to figure out if the person has a gun, if they have been stockpiling their pills, and in this level, this moderate level, this is someone who has suicidal thoughts, and that's accompanied by either a plan for suicide or a past suicide attempt. Again, we're going to express concern. We're going to work collaborative with the client to get buy-in for limiting access to that means. So for hotline work, someone over the phone, we might say, okay, so you're sitting there holding the gun, right? Do you think you can place that gun on the table and take a few steps back, right? And so slowly, incrementally, baby steps, we are trying to get that person to detach from that, that means, which is in their eyes a source of relief or a source of safety, right? Once somebody has gotten to the point where they have decided that they are going to die by suicide, that plan becomes very important, and they're protective of that. So we are going to identify coping strategies, safety plans. Again, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Connect to a professional if there is somebody that they are working with, and if that person, and if that is 988 or Lifeline, that is an option as well, right? Maybe they don't have a therapist or a primary care doctor, but you can always look to Lifeline. These are situations where check-ins are going to be important, and that might be something worked into your safety plan, and regular repeated assessments, right? So just because they felt suicidal, last month and they haven't talked about it since does not mean that that's like gone away, right? And that they're never going to think of suicide again, right? The continued conversation and assessment is critical. Again, not just for destigmatizing, but also for helping the client understand that you care and that you're invested in what they're going through.
Amy, can I jump in for 1 second? Sorry.
Sure.
Let you get a drink. Sorry, I was thinking more about Terry's question, and it's just before I forget. If your client has no mean, that they don't have a plan, I think any client who's going through a suicidal, any sort of mental health crisis should be screened for firearms. So if you have a client who, and also dementia, anybody who's having like major mental health issues should be screened if they have a firearm. And it's not again, a political thing. You don't have to say you have to get rid of the guns forever, but while you're struggling with whatever this issue is, can you give it to, your veteran buddies? Can you get a gun safe? Can you do that? But I would think back to Terry's question, even if they don't have a plan, or even if they don't mention using a firearm, I would screen anybody who's in a mental health crisis for a firearm. Sorry, I had to jump in there.
No, that's okay. Let's see, where was I? Okay, and then knowing that hospitalization is possible if the individual is not sure that they can stay safe or isn't willing to keep themselves safe, right? And we are also going to talk about hospitalization in a little bit. So someone who's a high risk, how do we know someone is a high risk? So someone who is a high risk is going to have suicidal thoughts with either a plan or a past attempt and an intent to carry through, or a lack of buffers, or it can be and a lack of buffers, right? So and or. So this is a person who we do not want to leave alone, right? This is a person who has a serious high risk of suicide and has all of the things that they need to complete that. And they have a plan, they have a means, and they have an intent, and there is not very many things or nothing keeping them connected, right? And so this is a person who we don't want to leave alone. We want to express concern, and we want to collaborate with the individual to get them to safety in some way, shape, or form. That can look like a lot of different things depending on the individual. It does not always mean 911. For some people, in some areas, it could be mobile crisis, right? Here in Montgomery County, we have a mobile crisis team that can go out. Our emergency services are pretty, aware of how mobile crisis works, and some are trained in managing crisis related to mental health. And but that is not the case in all areas, right? So it could look like connecting with a professional, right? Their psychiatrist, their therapist, their doctor. It could be connecting with just their parent who's in the other room, or their neighbor who can help them stay safe, or again, we're focusing here on older adults, one of their kids, or a significant other, right? All right, I'm going to come back to this question about what if someone declines to be connected with a professional, because I want to make sure we get through this, and we'll answer that at the end. Rachel, can you write that down so I don't forget? So this is someone who's a high risk of suicide, and we want to make sure that we take steps necessary to get them the professional help they need.
Okay, so you guys already sort of know the answer to this one, but I am going to launch a quick poll. Does everyone who has suicidal thoughts have to go to the hospital? Okay, well, Amy sort of answered that already too. But yes, the answer is no, and we'll talk about that why. And I think also we'll get to the answer of the question about the when we get to do a deeper dive into safety planning, you'll see how you can sort of work with somebody who's a little bit reluctant to get connected. But yeah, the answer is no. The vast majority of people who are suicidal do not need to go to the hospital, and the hospitals aren't the best place for them anyway. And we'll circle back around to that in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, so unfortunately, things have been changing across the country and in Maryland here. And there are counties in Maryland, not Montgomery, but there are counties in Maryland where the police are no longer enforcing emergency petitions for a variety of reasons. This is not a political discussion. We have some fantastic police in Montgomery County who have done really sensitive work. They're great CIT trained folk, but there are some counties where people are not enforcing emergency petitions. That means when you call the police to go out, they won't, right? So what does that mean for you? That means that needs to be, sometimes you start, in some situations, you're always going to have to call 911. If the person's already started maybe ingesting a substance or they have a gun, you're going to have to call 911. But if you can make a really good safety plan, you probably won't have to. Remember, on the hotline, we do hundreds of suicide screenings every month, and less than 10% of them need to go to the hospital or need a 911 call. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a really good safety plan. We'll talk about it in a minute. You're going to work with the client so they agree to seek treatment in the ED willingly if they need it. Have family members or other people transport them. You don't want to put a suicidal person behind the wheel of the car. And use mobile crisis teams. But mobile crisis teams also are having some trouble getting emergency petitions enforced. So don't assume as a clinician that if you sign an emergency petition. Also, keep in mind in the state of Maryland, police have 72 hours to follow up on an emergency petition. So you have an acutely suicidal client who has a gun to their head, they're going to go home and use it tonight, and you do an emergency petition for the client that's not working with you, the police might not get there for 72 hours. So you need to use all your other tools first before you rely on this one. Some people tend to just rely on this because it's either CYA or they think better safe than sorry. But there's a lot of reasons why you can't anymore, unfortunately. Next slide. Okay, so when do you hospitalize? So there is a fantastic book. If you're dealing with a lot of suicidal clients, I love this book. I recommend it for anybody. It's called Helping the Suicidal Person, by Stacy Friedenthal. She's fantastic. She is not only a therapist, but she has lived experience. And this is a really easy to read guide, and it gives you everything you need to know with working for suicidal folks. But she says, even people at high acute risk of suicide can be treated on an outpatient basis. And also Dr. Jobs from Catholic, who's does a lot of suicide work, agrees. The main factors to consider whether you need to hospitalize the person is there a lack of intent to act in the short term? Is it something they're going to do in the next 24 hours or not? And the ability about, can you make a strong safety plan that the client will abide by? Now, we're going to talk about safety plans in a minute. Safety plans need to be collaborative. It's not something that you write for the client and they have to follow. They are writing it because they're the ones that are going to have to do it, right? But the safety plan must include removal of means. It includes increase in frequency of sessions with their mental health provider and involvement of significant others. So even people with high acute risk don't need to go to the hospital if you have a really strong safety plan that includes these parts. But when in doubt, if that person's life is at risk, you can call 911. Okay. I'm not telling you not to call 911. I'm just saying, again, just because somebody's suicidal does not mean you need to call 911 or they need to go to the hospital. Next slide. It's not better safe than sorry. If you call 911 and the person is transported by police, it is traumatizing. There's potentially huge charges. There's also clinical reasons why going to the ED or being hospitalized when you're suicidal is not the best choice for your client. It's not better safe than sorry. Post-discharge from a hospital, suicide rates are 100 times higher than the global suicide rate. Let me repeat that. Post-discharge suicide rates were 100 times higher than the global suicide rate. The ED and the hospital do not have a magic wand that can take away the suicidality. They cannot wave a magic wand and make Frank not embarrassed and get Frank's $10,000 back, right? It's the clinical work that you're doing with Frank that's going to keep him safe, that safety plan you make with him. He can go to the hospital, but going to the hospital isn't going to fix things. Even years after discharge, the post-discharge rate is 30 times higher than the global rate. So again, if you think anybody who's suicidal needs to go to the hospital, or somebody's telling you that, it's actually clinically not that good for your client. If they are in danger, if their life is in danger, absolutely send them to the hospital, call 911, but don't do it because it's better safe than sorry, because there are ramifications to being hospitalized or going to the ED for suicide. So again, if your client needs it, do not hesitate to call 911. However, it shouldn't be your go-to for anybody who's suicidal. Just want to make that clear. But if you need it, use it. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we're going to do when we have a client, they've expressed suicidality, they might have a plan, is we're going to make a collaborative safety plan, right? When somebody gives you advice, you're much more likely to do this, less likely to do the steps of the advice if you had come up with a plan together. Like if Amy and I were talking and she's coming up with a plan to keep me safe, if I make suggestions about things I can do, I'm much more likely to do them than if she says, Rachel, here's what you're going to do. You're going to do X, Y, and Z, because I'm not bought into that plan. It's not things that I've generated that I can do, right? The main goal is to keep the person at risk from suicide safe. And you are not asking a person to abandon their plans. You are not, is anybody, I don't know how old this crowd is, but back in the day when I started, there used to be something called a no suicide contract, where clinicians would say, sign this piece of paper and promise me you'll never kill yourself. Guess what? If you do that and your client kills themselves, you are going to get sued, because it's been proven time and time again that does not work. So do not use a no suicide contract. That most places do not use it anymore. What you're doing with the safety plan is you're asking for a delay. You're in crisis right now. What I'd like to do is buy us some time to work together to see if we can lessen your pain. So you're not saying, promise me you'll never kill yourself, because that can freak people out. If that person's in tremendous amount of pain and they think the only way the pain is going to end is by killing themselves, they're not going to agree to that, or they're going to agree to that just to make you happy and not follow that. But what if you're saying is, for the next 48 hours, let's work together to keep you safe while we work on these issues, right? It is short term, max 72 hours, 24 hours. It can even be for the next hour, for the next 2 hours, whatever it needs to be. So it's tiny, tiny steps. Don't ask for promises. And again, if the client's in immediate danger, if they've already started taking pills or whatever, you're going to set an intervention. When you do this, a collaborative safety plan, the client always gets a copy. There are a lot of apps now that have this, so they can build it on their phone and just make sure they screenshot it and send it to you for your clinical records. Next slide, please. Okay, so the gold standard in safety plans, and it's built into some electronic medical records, so some of you might have this, is the Brown and Stanley safety plan. So if you type in Brown and Stanley safety plan, you can download this and use it all you want. This is the gold standard. It's been well researched. It is shown to be effective if you do it right. And again, it's collaborative. So you talk to your client and you say, what are some warning signs that a crisis may be developing, or that you're feeling worse, or that you're worried about, like that you're in danger? So if a client says, I'm okay during the day, but at nighttime, right? So maybe nighttime, being alone, those are sort of things. But it's going to be something not that they internally feel, not that you see, right? So maybe it's that they're not hungry, or maybe it's they don't want to watch whatever the show is, or maybe they don't feel like taking their grandchild's call when they call, right? Or texting with them. It's going to be those internal things that are triggered to them to that, oh, I'm not doing well right now, right? That's why they have to make it, because they're going to be the ones that notice that, and that's what they're noticing already. Step 2 is internal coping strategies. things that I can do to take my mind off my problems without contacting another person. Especially older people, can be very reluctant to reach out to other people, and this is a key one. If they're having trouble here, it is the Brown and Stanley safety plan. Even if you put in Brown safety plan, it should come up, but it's the Brown and Stanley safety plan. But ask the person, what do you lose track of time doing? Is it gardening? Is it playing Candy Crush? Is it watching the Orioles play baseball? Whatever it is, when do you lose track of time? Is it baking? What do they do to sort of take their mind off things? And even if it's for 5 minutes, if they say, well, I'll play Candy Crush for 5 minutes and then all the pain comes roaring back in. All right, that's a 5-minute reprieve. And 5 minutes distracted from your pain is better than no minutes distracted from your pain. So start small. Okay, so you're going to play Candy Crush. What else, right? You mentioned that your grandkids text a lot. You know, how's your pain? Maybe your pain is a 5 normally, but when you're texting with your grandkids, it's a 3. So it's not totally gone away, but it's gone down. So you're going to use those sort of Likert scales, and you're going to find things, and they're going to come up with those things. Next is people in social settings that provide distraction, right? So this was a little harder during COVID. Things are easier now, but this is not who you're going to tell that you're suicidal. It's where you can go or people that you can interact with that distract you, right? So again, you want to be sensible about this. So if Frank goes to the VFW hall and that's a distraction for him, but he's going to drink and that's going to increase his suicidality, that might not be the best choice. So you have to really kind of talk through these different things. Is it going down to the local diner and hanging out there with some pals? Is it going to church or synagogue or wherever? Talk through it. And again, this is a mind that's weighed down by suicidality. So you might have to prompt them a little bit, but you want them to come up with it. And think about things they've mentioned earlier in the conversation. And that will help with coming up with it. Next slide. Thank you. All right. So people who I can ask for help, and they're going to say no. I'm not asking anybody. I'm not gonna, this is too personal. I told you, I kind of regret that already. I'm not gonna tell anybody. Okay. So let's think about the people in your life. Would you want your son, if your son was feeling as bad as you are right now, would you want him to talk to you about it? What about your battle buddy from World War II or Vietnam? If your buddy was feeling suicidal, again, you told me a couple weeks ago that you guys all went out, all your Vietnam buddy friends went out on a big motorcycle ride to cheer up one of your friends. Would you want to tell me? I don't want to go too fast through here, but I'll get to it. Would you want them to tell you? And then professionals and agencies you can contact. Lifeline is there 24/7. Do you have a clinician? Do they know where the local ED is they can walk into? Do you have a crisis center in your area who they can talk to? And then making the environment safe. And again, this is what Amy was talking about. Taking the bullets out of the gun, putting it in storage. If they have 6 months worth of pain medication, maybe only making sure you only have 2 or 3 days worth or a day's worth, and having a neighbor hold the rest. You can say like, hey, my grandkids are coming over. I don't want them to have all these pain pills around. Can you hold this for a few days? Well, I just need 1 or 2 pills a day, things like that. And then the bottom one is the one thing that's most important to me and worth living for is, right? So what has gotten them in front of you? Sorry, I'm trying to be mindful of time. Next slide, please. Okay, HIPAA. A lot of people cite HIPAA as the reason why they're not going to do something for a suicidal person. So this is from HIPAA. For patients who screen positive for suicide ideation and deny or minimize suicide risk or decline treatment, obtain corroborating information by requesting the patient's permission to contact friends, family, or outpatient treatment providers. Everybody working with your client should be aware they're suicidal, their primary care physician, their physical therapist, everybody. If the patient declines consent, HIPAA permits a clinician to make these contacts without the patient's permission when the clinician believes the patient may be a danger to self or others. So HIPAA is not an excuse for taking proper suicide steps. Next slide. Sorry, time got away from me. I could talk about this all day, as you can tell. Okay, real quick. A safety plan is a crisis management tool. It is not clinical treatment. So it's very important for your clinical notes, right? If you want to learn more about clinical treatment, I highly recommend CAMS Care. It's like about 8 sessions that you can watch videos. It's great from Dr. Jobs down at Catholic. There's DBT. They cover some suicidal stuff. There's CBT. So definitely, if you're treating somebody ongoing, that should be your clinical treatment. The safety plan is a crisis management tool. Next slide. Just a reminder for those of you in Maryland about ERPO. It authorizes police, clinicians, and family members to petition the court to request that people who are behaving dangerously or at risk of committing harm to themselves or others can be temporarily prohibited for purchasing and possessing guns. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Follow-up is essential. This is huge. I'm going to do this quickly. When you talk to that suicidal person, you want to follow up with them. So if you make a great safety plan with them, you need to follow up with them within 24 hours, right? You can do it by phone, email, text, a letter. If your client gets taken to the ED or the hospital, you need to follow up with them within 24 hours of discharge because we know they're at higher risk. Do they have do they do safety plan with the hospital? What is the safety plan? How's it working? What you do in that conversation is, how are they feeling? How is the safety plan? Do you need to change anything? Is it, adjusted as needed? And then provide additional resources. It reduces suicide after an ED visit and inpatient services. It can lower suicide rate up to 5 years. And I can tell you, when we do follow up on phone, text, and chats, people are so grateful that you took the 2 minutes to check in and see how they're doing. It is so simple and it's so easy, and it makes such a huge impact. Next slide. I think this is you, Amy.
Okay, again, quickly, because we're supposed to end at 3, and we want to see if we can answer 1 or 2 questions. So again, what can we do? This is a little bit of review. We're going to ask about the depression, the anxiety, the suicidal ideations, and we're going to ask without judgment. We're going to talk, have a conversation about suicide. We want to appear comfortable in talking about this. People have said, I have answered suicide calls, and no matter how panicked I feel on the inside or how nervous, I want to make sure that I am relaying that and relaying in the conversation that I'm comfortable talking about suicide, and that this is a judgment-free zone, right? We're going to talk about means, limit access to means if possible, and then help them identify someone to help them. We're going to talk about resources, and we're going to talk about barriers, right? What are the barriers of treatment, stigma associated with suicide? These are all things we're keeping in mind, but really, like in the midst of it, ask, talk, means, right? These are your main things that you want to think about. Encourage people to build positive coping skills. So this I mentioned earlier, the difference between a coping mechanism and a coping skill. The difference between that is a mechanism is something that people use to escape from the pain or from the problem. It is not something that is making them stronger, and it's not solving the problem long term. A coping skill are abilities that people learn and work towards that is going to enable them to manage emotional and mental difficulties, right? And that is going to make somebody stronger. And the more people are able to work on these coping skills in times of not having crisis, the better they are going to be able to deal with crisis when they are faced with that. So this is why therapy is very important. Even if for someone who has not experienced suicidal ideation in ever or in a long time, that continued therapy is building those coping skills. These are some of the links to safety plans and safety apps that Rachel mentioned before. Many of these can just be downloaded on a phone. And then I'm not sure, Rachel, oh, this is the safety plan that you had mentioned before. This is the link to that.
This is a great website. by Montgomery County. It gives you a lot of information. It's for like written for general public and great to share with people. The other thing I really like, if you're working with somebody who is supporting a suicidal family member, suicideisdifferent.org is a great website. If you have somebody who's supporting an older parent who is suicidal, it's a really great resource.
Okay. So we have like 3 minutes. So somebody asked earlier, I don't know, Rachel, if you want to zoom through and see if there's any questions you want to specifically answer, but somebody asked earlier, what if somebody declines to be connected with a professional or 911? So of course, Rachel, jump in here, but this is where that safety plan is critical, right? So most people are going to decline having an officer come to their house, right? There's a lot of stigma associated with that. It sounds like a daunting situation, but this is where the buy-in will come in. If you are working collaboratively with a client, what works for them, right? If they don't want to call their therapist because they're afraid that they're going to disappoint their therapist by, being suicidal or having suicidal thoughts, what's another option, right? And this is instead of telling someone what they're going to do, we are going to try to come up with ideas collaboratively, and that person feels that they have input into, right? So that little by little, you are getting to a point where that person will be open to those ideas. And sometimes it takes saying, okay, well, these are our options, right? We could call 911 because we need to make sure that you're going to stay safe, or we can do something different. Let's talk about what those options are, what those different options are, and what works for you. I don't know, Rachel, you want to jump in here at all?
Yeah, there was a question. At what point in the conversation should we introduce a safety plan? And whether you're on the phone or not, you definitely don't want to go from yes, I'm suicidal to let's make a safety plan, right? You want to do an exploration of risk and then talk about why they're suicidal. Again, you're not going to ask them why, but you're, all the different things that are causing them pain, what's going on. And once you've really given them the chance to discuss their pain, like the video showed, then you're gonna talk about safety plan. Like Frank, you shared so much with me. Thank you for sharing all the things that are going on. I can, see that you're in so much pain, and that would be overwhelming for you. Do you think that we could work together for the next 48 hours on these issues? And can we work on a plan to keep you safe just for the next 48 hours while we talk more about these things that you have brought up today, or till we connect you to a therapist, or we connect you to your priest who you want to talk to, or whoever it is that they want to, that you think they can be connected to. So you can bring that up, but you don't want to go straight from, yes, I'm suicidal, to here, let's make a safety plan. You want to assess that risk and then kind of talk more about why, what's going on in their lives, what's causing the pain, and give them a chance to let that air out of the balloon, and let some of that stuff some of that stuff off the chest, because getting it off the chest is probably the most healing thing they can do, just having somebody listen and take them seriously.
Well, thank you. Thank you both so much. Our presenters from EveryMind, Rachel Larkin and Amy Fier, you have given us so much incredible information. Thank you for your time. This has been a power 2 hours. And I just want to remind everyone that the PowerPoint deck and a copy of the recording will go out tomorrow, so you'll all have these reference materials. And please visit our website, smithlifecommunities.org, for information on upcoming ElderSAFE webinars. Just as a reminder, on June 7th, we're having an ElderSAFE prevention and intervention through a trauma-informed lens. That will take place from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And on August the 16th, we will be presenting Creative Aging, Enhancing the Lives of Older Adults Through Arts Education from 1 to 3 p.m. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great afternoon. Take care.